Major funding for the Great American Quilt is provided by Fairfield Processing Corporation, maker of Polyfill brand products for crafting, by RJR Fashion Fabrics, where innovation is a tradition, by New Home, changing the way America sews, by Keepsake Quilting, publishers of the Keepsake Quilting Catalog, the Quilter's Wish Book, by American School of Needlework Incorporated, publisher of books in all areas of needlework, and by Lehman Publishing, publisher of Quilter's Newsletter Magazine, the magazine for quilt lovers.
Hi, have you been wondering why we're not showing you some flag quilts if the title of the show is The Great American Quilt? Well, today's the day we're going to really specialize in them. We've got old and new flags to see. Diana and Laura have this great star block, which I thought was particularly appropriate, and they'll be showing you in a minute how to make it. But if you know me, I like you to start with a little history first. So I'm going to take you back in time. We'll just back up a little bit and talk about the time of the Civil War and how women were involved with making flag quilts and other quilts for soldiers. You know, when stories about the hardships the men were suffering came back, women really reacted immediately. They threaded their needles and by hand and machine sewed what probably added up to be close to 250,000 quilts. That's 1/4 which is an incredible number, even by today's standards. Some of these quilts went directly to the soldiers in the field, while others were sold to raise what was literally millions of dollars at that time to send food, clothing, and essential supplies.
We must all work for our country. Our soldiers must be equipped. Our parlor was the rendezvous for our neighborhood, and our sewing machine was in requisition for weeks.
Women sending quilts with flags and other designs to soldiers knew that their needlework would reach soldiers that they didn't even know, but they hoped that if their quilt warmed a soldier at night, that someone else's quilt might reach their own loved one, either in the field or in a hospital bed. Now, not all flag quilts were made during the Civil War, and not all Civil War quilts were made during the war itself. Melanie Schulteis, for example, sewed a loving tribute to her husband James 37 years after the war. James Schulteis had been in the thick of action. As a Union spy, he'd been caught and imprisoned 6 times and lived to tell about it all. But that's only part of the story, for this is a love story. You see, Melanie and James weren't originally meant to marry each other. Melanie had sent another boyfriend off to war and waited for him back in Indianapolis. One day, a young soldier came to find her and told her that her boyfriend, his companion in the trenches, had died in action. His dying thoughts were of Melanie, and his friend had promised to find her and convey a last message. When the bad news had been delivered, the soldier offered his sympathy and asked if he might see Melanie again. Well, you can guess the rest. The soldier was James. He and Melanie were married and lived happily enough after to have 12 children and observed their 62nd wedding anniversary before James died in 1928. Although thousands of flag quilts were made, as you can well imagine, a lot of them were used up, so they're relatively rare today. And I wanted to take a look at one wonderful collection that specializes in flag quilts. It's owned by Milton and Marilyn Breckner, and they have it in the offices of the Family Toy Company, which is in Long Island. The office is a perfect example of how quilts are being used to warm up workplace walls today. In fact, Milton Breckner had his company's new offices designed especially with his quilt collection in mind. He intentionally created this spare space so that all eyes would be drawn to the wonderful red, white, and blue quilts. Asked how many quilts he has, Breckner's been quoted as giving the same answer a friend's grandmother did when asked how many grandchildren she had. She answered, "I never count them, I just love them." The last quilt that we looked at was made with souvenir handkerchiefs from the centennial, and I'll be showing you a bicentennial quilt in a minute. But now, how about that beautiful star that Laura and Diana did? We'll take a look at this, and they'll show you a lesson on color and design.
One of the interesting aspects of quilt making is being able to take your fabrics and choose a color scheme. We're going to be talking about that today, and we're going to give you the memory block in which you can work and make a color scheme from. Then we'll show you the sew order and how to construct and put all of this together. We will then be talking about the memory in a line drawing and the shapes and how you see different things from just the line drawing.
We've asked 5 different quilt makers to take this line drawing and develop their own color scheme so we can share with you some of the different ways in which they've developed it. I think this will be real helpful when you're ready to choose your fabrics.
It sure will. And then we will end with showing our all-star quilt.
We've got a full lesson plan today.
We sure do. We will start off with the memory block. And we have over here...
All of the shapes are set out in the order in which they're going to be sewn together. It looks pretty complicated, doesn't it? But it's not. All of these techniques you've already learned before in previous lessons. All of the squares, the smaller squares are cut 2.5 inches. The large center square is cut 4.5 inches. And then we have a number of half square triangles and double half square triangles. These are techniques that you may be unfamiliar with, and we're going to give you a quick review from 2 previous lessons. The half square triangle, let's take a look at how it's made. First, alternately layer 2 fabrics, right sides together. Cut the layered fabrics into strips and then into squares. Cut the squares in half diagonally. Sew a light and a dark pair of triangles together. Finally, press them open to make a completed half square triangle unit. And it looks just like this. The double half square triangle, let's take a look at how this one's made. First, place a square over the rectangle, right sides together, and stitch them together diagonally. Next, trim the bottom 2 layers of fabric 1/4 of an inch out from the stitching line. Finally, place a square on the opposite side, stitching and cutting the same way. Then press to make a completed double half square triangle unit. And it looks just like this. Let's put these 2 pieces right back into the block in the order in which they'll be. The strips for cutting the half square triangles are 2.5 inches wide. And the pieces needed for the double half square triangle, for the squares, you'll cut them 2.5 inches, and the rectangle is cut 2.5 by 4.5. Let's see how this works together in our unit method of construction.
And we have the units here all broken apart for you so you can see how we're going to sew them together. And we'll take the half square triangles and whoop, there we go. And we're going to sew those pairs together, and then we're going to sew them now into where the 4 are joined together. And you can come on down and see how it goes into row 1. Now then, we will come up here at the top and we will start to do our double half square triangles together, and we'll put these 2 together, and you can see this nice chevron shape forming now coming. And here's our unit here, and the unit going down into row 2. Now, row 3 is the same as row 1, so we will now join row 1 to 2 and 3 to 2. And now we have the completed block over here.
Looks just great. You might want to know how these blocks are going to look together in a full quilt if you're making a number of memory blocks. And let me show you, this is a quick, and I think it's just a wonderful little tip to give you just a preview of what's going to happen. See this seam here? This is what will happen. This is the design that will form when the blocks are joined together. Now if I fold this, bringing the corners into the center of the block, oh, look at this. We've got another star. Can you see the star here? See the line drawing here. We mentioned that we had given this line drawing to several different quilt makers, and you'll notice that they've all interpreted it in just a little bit different manner. This block here was made by Wren Brown. Now when Wren Brown saw this, she focused in on the center star, and she wanted that to really stand out. So she was able to do that by placing these dark green triangles around a nice floral center, and that really puts the emphasis right in the center of the block.
When you want to choose a decorator fabric, you can do just exactly like Ren and choose your color scheme from it. That's what she did for...
It's what she used here in these shapes, right? Let me show you quickly. I have one, and you may have seen these before in the shops and thought, oh, this would be great for a border, but of course you're not using it for a border here, so you might overlook it. Let me show you some of the possibilities. I've just cut a little square out of a piece of cardboard, and when I just run it over the fabric, look what I find here. Isn't this a beautiful little flower?
It's exciting to see that.
It would be great placed in the square, and look at this possibility here. Let's run it over here, and you can see this stripe area. It would just be beautiful. So don't overlook some of these fabrics. They offer just a lot of possibility.
Now, Karen Matsumoto, she also chose her fabric from this large space here in the design, and she has taken the square over here and chosen all of the colors in her block from her centerpiece. Then she just added upon what colors were in here with some very interesting design fabrics to form it, and the stripes forming the chevron. Isn't it fun to see when all four of these blocks are going together? You see now more pattern and design going on, and this is what's so exciting about quilt making, is because you never really know what's happening. This may have been just a spontaneous design that formed with this lattice work when you have this real deep, bright, shiny background. It's sort of like a lattice on top of looking back into something.
It does. I like how she's used this stripe here in the parallelograms. Isn't that a wonderful little chevron effect she has? It's great. Oh, look at this happy block. This was made by Eleanor Peace Bailey, and oh, it's just so playful, and it's a little bit daring. I mean, look at the number of plaids that she has combined together. Eleanor is a doll maker, and so she's accustomed to combining a lot of different color and prints, and you can see that displayed in her block here. She started with this large floral fabric, which she placed in the center and then repeated out in the corners, and oh, it's just... Do we have another one?
Yes, we do. We have Ann Rody's, and Ann's is done with contemporary fabrics. She has hand-dyed her fabric for the center and carried it out here in this little square. This star just sparkles. You know, Ann really doesn't like little calico prints, but she just loves bold fabrics that she can slice and cut up. And notice the tips on this star, how wonderful they are. Into this wonderful deep blue background, it makes you feel like this star is just floating in space.
Look at Mabry Benson's. Mabry loves red, and so when Mabry was given the block, naturally she would choose red as the predominant color here. But then she added some blue, and look at how nice and strong these shapes come forward. Oh, it's just it's a wonderful use.
Let's look and see what happens now when all of this goes together.
Oh, look at this. Now we see these real strong. They almost look like squares in squares, don't they? And
yes.
gives a layered effect.
But the red is still predominant here too.
That's right.
So it's sort of a toss-up. Which one can you see?
I think it's interesting to see the different possibilities in playing with just the same line drawing.
Oh, yes.
We have two more blocks to share with you. We call this our all-star quilt.
Can you see the memory blocks? Can you guess which one is Laura's and which one is Diana's?
No hints now.
I like birds.
Oh.
I hope you enjoy them. Work with color is fun.
Don't you like that memory star? I like the way the design kind of echoes as it moves out. I'm back to flags because I wanted to show you some new flag quilts. There were a lot of flag quilts done for the bicentennial, and this is one of them. It's by Alice Fry, who's from Englewood, Colorado. I think this is just a gorgeous quilt, and it shows that women are still putting the same kind of effort into bicentennial quilts as they did for the centennial. Look at West Virginia and Washington here, the two on the top row. I like the look that Washington seems to have on his face. It looks like he's kind of looking down at some of the other stars or some of the other states, and he looks a little amused. I think he's probably glad to be in the top row. She put so much time into this. This is one of those quilts that I think will definitely show up in quilt books from 100 years from now when they're talking about how women used to make quilts for the bicentennial exhibition. She has hundreds of hours of embroidery in this quilt, and it's gorgeous. The next quilt I wanted to show you, I have to show you in slides because it's currently on tour with Quilt National 91. It's a quilt by Carol Gerson. We've seen a couple of her quilts already, and it has, I thought, a perfect design for this show, particularly because of the piecing technique. She's using those quick piecing techniques and these wonderful flags. I wanted you to see flags don't have to be red, white, and blue. And I was amused when I heard Carol's explanation of why she decided to make flags out of all those squares. She said that she just happened to have 4,000 little squares around from a piecing project. So it's amazing what she did with them. I can't imagine the project that she would have done where she would have had 4,000 left over. Here's Jane Blair's idea of a completely different flag. This is done with a lot of patterned fabric, and it just gives a whole different look. Look at the way she's quilted a star into one of those flags on the corner. She's done a lot with quilting here, and she's also used border prints in a really nice way on another part of the flag where the stars would be. This is called Y.D. Dandy, and she has quilted the plume of Yankee Doodle into that paisley section. Now, I have asked Rod to try to find us a flag quilt, and I'm not sure whether he has or not. We're talking on the phone. You probably wonder why on earth I don't know what he's found, but he's finding some of them, and I'm finding others, and he thought he had a great lead on a quilt with stars and flags right in the lattice strip, so we'll see if he's got his hands on that one. Well, you mentioned lattice strip with flags on it, so I'm hoping you were able to get that one.
I did. I asked my collector friend, Virginia McElroy, to loan me 2 quilts, one of which I'm using in my book, and then I also got the flag quilt from her, too.
This is great. Flag quilts are so rare, and here it is. It sounded interesting when you told me about this one.
Yeah.
With the flags and the lattice strips. Look at this blue fabric. It's the same
Star print
Yeah.
it's similar. I mean, it's just the blue and whites, the indigo blue and whites just had so many different patterns printed with them, and they're such a favorite.
Blue and white quilts?
Yes, with quilt makers. They love the indigo blue fabrics because it was washable and durable.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the best quilts that I found in dealing were blue and whites, and they always have great quilting. And
they're still really in demand, aren't they, by collectors?
they are,
blue and white.
because it's a favorite color combination today. Quilt makers are still making it, and collectors love it.
Now, in this, you've got a lot of grays. Is there a name for these kind of?
They're called mourning prints, and they're very typical of
Mourning as in?
M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G, of the 1890s to 1910s, and that's when you're going to see like these shirting fabrics too.
Were these made for men's shirts? Is that what they're called, shirtings?
Yes.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So if
It's
people
kind of
have these kinds of gray prints, it's some kind of an indication, maybe 1880s, 90s?
1880s is a little too early
Little
for
early?
it. 1890 to 1910 is when
Okay.
you're going to more see it.
Okay.
It's kind of a
Hi, we're back with a special guest. I first met her, Terry Mangut. I've got to look out for your quilt, Terry. When we shot an interview with her a few years ago for our earlier series, she's here, and you can see we've got her quilt on the floor because it was so big. We tried using the table, and it was just huge. You're doing bigger and bigger. Last time we saw you with a little tiny quilt. This is Fern Garden, which is absolutely gorgeous. Tell me about the subject matter of this, because I know you've got gardens. And
I enjoy gardening. I've done several garden quilts, and they started out being, the garden being a symbol for a place where growth takes place. This particular quilt is more just an aesthetic quilt. It's a depiction of a fern garden of a friend of mine. And on this quilt, I did my normal use of fabrics together, which I always is what excites me about quilt making.
Yeah, that's what I always like about looking at the little individual fabric next to fabric. Tell me about the leaves there. Is that the embroidery around and the use of that paint?
I've used paint in this particular quilt in a different way than I had in some of my other ones. I remember when I was young, I used to do a lot of embroidery, and then they came out with those Bogart paints, and I can remember thinking, oh, they're so tacky. Why would anyone want to use paint instead of embroidery? It would, you know, it just wouldn't cut it. But now, after studying art and wanting to get more into painting, I started to enjoy the way paint looks next to the fabrics, next to the embroidery. And so I love the integration of the threads with the paint. On this particular one, I drew the paint lines first, and then I embroidered inside the leaves with the, to fill them out. And there's about 200 hours of embroidery in that central section.
So you're kind of saying, yeah, I'm using the stuff that was made for fake embroidery, but I'm embroidering with it too. So
Right.
I want to see the one underneath this. This you did very recently.
This particular quilt I did during the Desert Storm War, when it was on TV so much. And I had mixed feelings about that war. I really wanted to be patriotic, but I've traveled a lot, and my family, my husband's family lives around the world, and so I have sort of a view of everyone as being our brother. And so when we sort of didn't acknowledge that we killed 100,000 other people, it was really hard for me to get into the joyfulness that was happening when the war ended, because I was also experiencing a sadness. So this quilt is about that terror that was happening in my heart. So it has body bags all over it and yellow ribbons, which is the two elements that I saw happening in the war.
So the yellow ribbon to you is not really a celebratory kind of thing. You're using it as, and they look like they're tying up missiles there.
Well, it's like we've got our yellow ribbons tied around our missiles. We hope that we're going to throw these missiles in there fast and get it over with and not even think about it and go on as usual, consuming oil like we always have, and yet not paying attention to the fact that in doing so, it was real people that the bombs were hitting.
The cars that you've got, those are real toy cars. They're smashed up. How did you didn't find those?
I got those in New York. And I had a young boy smash them with a sledgehammer. I wanted to show, they sort of remind you of all of those vehicles we saw in the desert that were just abandoned, but they also remind me of how callous our country is in the disposable personality of the way we could just consume things and throw things away. In other countries, people usually make cars last for 40 or 50 years, and we just put ours in the dump immediately after a few years.
One of the things I always notice about your quilts is they come kind of from your feeling at the time, which is very traditional for a lot of quilt makers, you know, back in the 1850s. What's next for you? What do you what's in your mind now, and what would we be seeing coming out?
I'm in a mood right now to drop back a little bit. I've done all these really intense quilts that have a lot to do with what's happening inside of me, and now I'm thinking about making some traditional quilts for the bed again. It's like dropping back to just working with the colors, working with the way the fabrics work together. I've always enjoyed scrap bag quilts, so I'm thinking that right now I want to try to put out some quilts for the bed.
Getting back to what first interested you when you saw those boxer shorts.
Right.
You work with boxer short fabric.
Right.
Way
Just
back.
get right back. What attracted me to quilt making in the beginning was how the fabrics work next to each other.
Great. I'll look forward to that.
Thanks.
Thanks, Terry. We are talking a little bit today about national issues on quilts, and I thought that it would be very interesting to look at a couple of quilts that are about serious subjects, as Terry's quilt is. One of these is about conflict, and it's by Catherine Nauer. Catherine says that her design originally started out just to use the black and white fabric with a camouflage fabric. She bought that in an Army-Navy surplus store and then hand-stenciled figures on. The quilt was originally intended to be about just conflict in general, just one side against another. But what she ended up with, she admits, was a depiction of racial conflict. For the quilt was made during news reports of an incident in which a black man was beaten to death by a gang of white men. It's a strong graphic design full of sharp angles and jagged diagonals. It's Catherine's way of getting across a strong viewpoint in a soft medium. Catherine's from New York City. Mary Mashuta's quilt, Coming to Terms, is also about conflict, although more indirectly because it's about conflicting viewpoints. It's a quilt with two completed sides. You're just seeing one of them now. She writes about her quilt, "Vietnam was my generation's war. There are more than two sides involved in a war, even though that's all it takes to fight it. I wanted to make a quilt about the war and speak about this duality, to speak about those who, because of their patriotism, went to fight the war. At the same time, I wanted to speak about those who, because of equal patriotism, took a stand and said we shouldn't be fighting the war. If a quilter ever needed a two-sided quilt, this was the time." It was a really thoughtful quilt. I like the way today's quilt makers are putting what they think into quilts. Next week we'll be talking about quilt styles, and Nancy Crow will be here to show you how she's really breathing new life into that well-loved style, the double wedding ring. So I hope you can be with us.